Hello, everyone, and welcome to the API Security Panel here at Security Weekly Unlocked. I'm Mike Shima, your moderator today, and someone who's going to be speaking perhaps a little bit less than the others, considering that tongue twister. APIs, of course, tie everything together from cloud to mobile to IoT or to more APIs. They not only have to be coded securely and handle data securely, they must do so in a way that remains flexible despite supporting potentially inflexible devices. In other words, we want to make them an advanced persistent infrastructure rather than yet another programming insecurity. To talk about this, our awesome panelists include Kevin Johnson, who is the CEO of Secure Ideas. He has a long history in IT and security, building IR teams, architecting security solutions, and pen testing. He's also a faculty member at IANS and was an author for 3 SANS Institute classes. Hello, Kevin.
Hi, how you doing?
We also have Jason Kent, who joins us from Sequence Security. He's spent the last 20 years helping organizations secure their assets and their intellectual property, including APIs. As a researcher, he has found flaws in consumer IoT systems and insisted in hardening them. Hello, Jason.
Hey, how's it going?
Going well. Erez Yalan heads the security research group at Checkmarx. He has a vast defender and attacker experience. That, plus his dev experience with many languages, helps him maintain Checkmarx's top-notch vulnerability detection technology. And quite helpfully for today's discussion, he spearheaded the OWASP API Top 10. Hello, Erez.
Hey, Mike and everyone. Nice to see you.
Glad to have you here. And also we have Sven Morgenroth, is a security researcher at NetSparker. He has found filter bypasses for Chrome's XSS auditor and several web app firewalls. He writes about web app security and documents his research on the NetSparker blog. Hello, Sven.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. And what I'd like to do is let's start off with an idea of some of the risks associated with APIs and use that to work our way backwards towards designing and building them in a secure manner. So I'm going to throw out a first question and then perhaps just pick on the order that I see in my screen here. And the idea here is I mentioned that there's a lot of devices that consume APIs, much more than just web browsers. So I'm curious, how does that range of clients influence the way we should be thinking about the threat models for our APIs? And Jason, I see you smiling, so I wonder what your thoughts here are.
Well, the funny thing is I deal with this a lot with our clients and see, I don't know, 50 different ways people implement this. They'll build an API that's just for an iPhone. They'll build an API that's just for Android endpoints. They'll build an API that's for web. I've also seen people use all the same API for everything. Segregating the traffic makes it a lot easier to say, well, this one's coming in bad, or we can utilize some control technology for the specific endpoint. But I haven't ever seen anybody implement everything well. I often see them do things like, well, new Android functionality, we'll put in a new version of the API, not deprecate the old version, and you can still attack it. So I'd love to hear from the other guys. Does anybody know a way to do this well, or have they seen it implemented well?
If I may.
Yeah, Kevin.
To answer your question, Jason, I have seen it done well, partially, right? Like I've seen some people do some things right, and then I don't know what happens, but they fall off a cliff. To answer the original question about clients, I think absolutely correct. I agree with what Jason said 100%. The additional thing I would add to that is that I believe that due to the nature of the clients, not Android, all that kind of different stuff, but the fact that in many cases, even though the original model of APIs was to expose endpoints and data and transactions to third parties and outside entities, most developers that I've talked to that are building APIs assume that they can trust the input or the calls to the API, because in many cases, they're either building that IoT device's operating, the operating system. I don't mean the OS, but the way it runs. Or they're working with the team internally, right? So, the API team and the Android team both work for the same company. So there is this idea that it's a trusted communication path. And so we actually see where they're redoing all the vulnerabilities they used to do in the traditional web apps They're just throwing it into an API and having the same problem. And when you talk to them, they're surprised that an attacker would have access to it.
Yeah, and speaking of the attacker, from the attacker perspective, yes, please add another version. Yes, please add another API. Please increase my attack surface. I'll be very happy to check more things for you, for myself. This is something we see all the time. And yes, I've seen some perfect designs. All of them stayed on paper. Everything then becomes patched and some new APIs, new versions flying in the air. It's all about documentation, I think, in a way, but I don't really know. I agree that I haven't seen the perfect one or the one that is attacker proof, for sure.
There's no such thing as attacker proof.
Yeah,
definitely
I
not.
also agree with what Kevin said, because you often have the case that web APIs of a certain site or company are very well protected. And then you have the same thing for Android apps or iOS apps. And developers just assume that nobody will even figure out the endpoint or try to interact with it. But once you decompile the app or like actually intercept the traffic to the API endpoints, you sometimes even don't have any authentication at all, and can just access endpoints and user data that wasn't protected at all against anyone who maybe figures out the endpoints or can actually decompile the app and figure out how things work.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's that theme there that kind of Kevin and Sven just now you were mentioning, that an assumption that perhaps the attackers or the builders aren't expecting attackers to understand or reverse engineer that endpoint. And yet one of the tenets about APIs is that they should be relatively self-documenting, because we actually want developers to consume them, to understand them. And so I'm kind of curious too, already Kevin was explaining how unfortunately APIs are reinventing the wheel of vulnerabilities. And we could roll back to 20 years and perhaps all of the RCEs and XSS and injection vulns would be pretty much the same. But looking at the OWASP API top 10, it has obviously quite a bit of overlap with the web top 10, but it does call out things like abuse and rate limiting in particular. And I'm kind of curious, going beyond just the idea of denial of service attack, old school type of attack, are there other scenarios or other types of things we should really be considering about APIs and the way that they get abused that perhaps is new in the way they are presenting information or expecting to be consumed? Or there's simply, we need a rate limiting on everything because the internet is not necessarily a friendly place to be.
If I may,
Please.
I love the API top 10. Let me rephrase that. I love most of what OWASP does, and I'm biased, right? But I think that the idea of rate limiting, one of the reasons that is something that many people need to think about, or at least the bulk grabbing of data from APIs, it's not that web apps and other applications aren't vulnerable to the same thing. It's commonly the API, as we said, is designed to be consumed and to provide data. And so because they're designed that way, they give way more than they should. I see in my testing, keep in mind, from my perspective, most of my testing is from an adversarial perspective. I'm pen testing, I'm attacking the API. But over the last couple of years, we've really focused on trying to embed ourselves into the development lifecycle and work with the developers. And it's a constant thing of, oh yeah, I know that somebody can request that and get every single piece of customer data, but that's okay. The API is designed to do that. No, it's not, right? That's going back to that mindset from the first question is, there's this idea of providing the data, but then being surprised when people consume the data, right?
Well, and from the perspective of the defender, from the side where they built the API and they don't want to be attacked, they see rate limiting as a scaling issue. right? If I'm getting hit really hard, I just need to get my elastic clusters to stretch more. Right? Let me turn it up. And I'm dealing with a client right now that gets 60,000 requests a minute when they're under attack, and only 6,000 of those are real requests. And what do? They turn on more servers, right? They just pump up the volume. And what the sort of backlash of that is, when they really want somebody to come, they have to scale so big that their costs go through the roof, and they have all these weird scaling problems. What they really need to have a good understanding of is who's hitting them, right? But they don't build that into their infrastructure.
And what's the purpose? Because
Right.
the consequences can be different. It can be denial of service. Okay, we all know that. But maybe someone is brute forcing you. Maybe someone is just trying to get all your information. Maybe they managed to hack something, and this is now their way to drink your entire database. So it's not only the common sense of, as you said, of denial of service, which is, just make it bigger. It's also, why is it happening? What are they taking and why?
Yeah, I think that gives us a great segue, because Jason was also mentioning the who is the attacking as well, to add another question to what Erez was just saying. So that brings us to the idea of identity. And we are definitely talking about attackers from an external perspective. And here's a lot of data that APIs are exposing. But there's also a lot of internal APIs that enterprises and large organizations are using, especially for their build and deployment pipeline, where suddenly you have a lot of services that are hooking in, touching where you're building your code, potentially manipulating your code or giving you feedback on your code. So this idea of identity and authorization really comes into play within your API design. So as we start to shift towards building and designing APIs, what are some of the ways that we can help devs better provision and manage the secrets that are actually necessary for all of these different services to talk to each other? Who wants to take that one first? So we need some identity. Sven, I didn't hear you on the last one, so I'm going to pick on you for this.
Right. So what often happens is that developers just push their API secrets to GitHub, and if that was the question, so they tend to do that as well. So it is very important to kind of separate the actual secrets from your other code. Like you have to maybe bundle them in a file that you can put into your git ignore, and maybe even pay a service to regularly check your version control systems, whether there were any secrets pushed to that system. There are also open source tools to do that, like GitRope, I think. And what you also can do is trying not to handle these secrets yourself. You can use an external service like HashiCorp Vault or similar services, where you kind of outsource the handling of these secrets to them and don't really have to put your developers in a position where they even have to touch these secrets themselves, but rather have them manage for them.
So,
I'm curious,
Mike,
if someone who's seen that done well. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm actually going to take you one step back. You talk about the secrets and you assume we use them. That would be a great step. I think that even before that, you talked about identity and authorization. It all comes to access control eventually.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And access control, well, you talked about the API top 10 that we created. 3 out of the top 5 actually is access control. It's about broken authentication and broken authorization. And there are a lot of misconceptions there way before you even start with secrets and passwords and tokens and all that. I'm sure I'm going to see some nods from my friends here, but yes. How many times you saw developers thinking that OAuth is authentication and confusing that for authentication instead of authorization?
Yes.
Or using API keys that are to identify a platform as user authentication, for example. or many other issues like that. So I think that even that has a step before, which means that some developers don't even think that they need to do that because, as Kevin said before, if I'm going to give it a really good, cool, unique ID, I don't need to protect anyone. No one will guess that.
Yep.
So getting into to secrets management is kind of step 3 beyond of the first steps of access control. And I think it all begins with the story. We obviously cannot really blame developers for what they're doing. We need to help.
Yeah.
And it's all about the definitions of the feature. Let's try maybe next time when we talk to a developer, and instead of telling them, I need that this button will get the user a document, let's say I need that this button will get only that user, only their document, for example. Even speaking like that will show us that we need some sort of access control here.
Yep.
This is kind of a first step. And then, I don't know, it's all about the implementation, obviously, which takes us back to your question now.
Yeah. I find that I love the way you said, talk about the story, right? When we, we do a lot of work talking to developers. Much of my staff used to be developers. We only hire consultants that did IT. We don't hire people that are just pure play security, because what we find, and look, I'm probably just as much to blame as anybody else for this idea that developers screw up, they're stupid, they don't understand security. We've placed security into an ivory tower. And what we find so often, that when we work directly with the developers and we find out what they're doing, or the business units that are coming up with these requirements, I need this API to do this or whatever, what we find is that the security recommendations they're getting are so out of touch with what they actually need to deploy and build and do, that they just get ignored. Or if they do get implemented, they don't actually fix anything, right? And a stupid example, but one that I see constantly, because like I said, one of our things is to embed in the development lifecycle. So we actually see pen test reports and security reports from other companies, right? Or other pieces of software, which is why we have such a bad opinion of certain software packages. But one of the things we find all the time is on RESTful APIs, the security tools, the automated source code control and configuration management tools will write things like, oh, you support the put method, and that's a critical finding, and you shouldn't support put. And it's like, no, you're absolutely right that in 1998, supporting the put method on a web server was a bad thing because of what that meant. But in a REST-based API, the put method is the standard way to do something. It's not that the method is supported that's bad. You have to actually test what the method calls and does. And security doesn't get that, right? We run NICTO or check marks against something and say, oh, this is bad. And that's a problem, right?
Yeah. You're definitely getting to the idea of what's the context here. And that also goes back to Erez. You made a great point. Context here between, OAuth isn't authorization, or what are we trying to do with this? So if we do roll back, quite importantly, to this idea of access control, and we kick off with Jason's initial question, who's done this well? Have we seen this done well? When we go in and have these conversations with teams and add, here's the context of what you're trying to do, rather than, nope, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that other thing either. And we just leave them with a shrug of like, well, what should I be doing in this case?
Yeah, and I think that, in my consulting life, I've done, I don't know how many developer trainings where I'm doing pen testing training to developers. And, getting back to Kevin's point on kind of the culture underlying this, when you walk in and teach a developer how to pen test, they immediately become a better developer because they start turning on those switches where they really understand, oh yeah, somebody could go grab that data, right? And I haven't seen it implemented extremely well. I've seen guarded organizations do things like, all right, we need to make sure we overlay, a good amount of security in this. And you find that in shops where security isn't in that ivory tower. Security isn't the Department of No. Security is just another input, right? And that's where we see a lot of these organizations that are not getting owned constantly have sort of moved to. But to go to the discussion that we had earlier, we are sitting in the year 2000 web development when you look at APIs under that glass, right?
Yes.
And what we need to do is get that same focus that we've had in DevSecOps, and all of those great words that we throw around. We just need to get that culture of security embedded so that people understand the thing I'm writing is going to impact the business in some way.
Yeah. If I may, Jason, I want to just tag a little bit on what you said. It's funny to me when you say I teach developers how to pen test. Absolutely, that is what we do. Every single time I talk to somebody about developer training, that's what we recommend. And a thing I've noted over the years of doing this is that if you talk to non-developers about developer training like this, PCI says we have to do developer training, so I guess we have to do developer training. Teach us secure coding. If you talk to the non-developers, all they want is secure coding. Like, show us how to do .NET secure string, or stupid examples like that. If you talk to the developers, they hate that type of training, because their answer is, well, we know how to code, even if they're not good at it, right? Because I suck at everything I do. But they don't want to sit in a 2-day class or a 10-day class or a 6-month class and learn code techniques. They want to know what the problems are. They want to know what the vulnerabilities are. And so if we teach them that, and I always love the phrase professionally evil, but I'm biased there. If we teach them the attack, there is something so satisfying about seeing a developer's eyes light up when they dump their entire database through a SQL injection. And it's like it clicks, like, oh, damn, that's bad. I should fix that. Yes, you should. Whereas if we did it the other way, like, oh, use parameterized queries. We know that, but nobody's engaged there. Nobody's excited. Yeah, totally teach people how to hack.
I can agree with that. And for example, the education and awareness platform we have in Checkmarks called Code Bashing is also from day one. We decided to focus on the adversary, on the attacker side. Obviously, yes, I'm going to show you how the code looks like and what was wrong and how to fix it. But I want you to think about the what if, and the what if is the important part.
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of want to broaden this too, because we're definitely talking about, this is a threat modeling discussion. We're asking the question, what could go wrong? So a little bit, I also want to push us a little bit to that third question of what are we going to do about it? So in the sense, because I want to agree very strongly with what you guys have been saying, in the sense that talking with developers, educating them is a fantastic way to go and teach them about security. One of the catches, though, that I'm going to posit is that I'm not sure that it's going to scale very well. And we do want to try to scale our security better. So if we have something like APIs that are supposed to be self-documenting, or if we're decorating our API endpoints with how they're supposed to be consumed, and we have something like the open API specification, can we add something to that also makes it easier either for manual testing to understand, for security testing, or making security tools more effective when we point them at our APIs?
Tools are not the way to go. Sorry, I disagree 100% with the statement that what we all described about training can't scale. It absolutely can scale, and it needs to scale. What doesn't scale, and don't get me wrong, I'm a greedy capitalist, so I'd like to say that all of your needs can be answered by anybody on this call that does consulting. But that's crap. The way you scale the training that we all just discussed is by teaching people to teach others, right? It's the same model that we scaled blacksmithing in medieval times, or the same model that we scaled any technique or skill set is you teach somebody, then they teach somebody. What we find very successful with customers that we work with that are doing it right and doing it well is that we teach them and they embed that teaching and training and understanding into everything that they do, right? That's how you scale it. That's how you fix it. Sorry,
No, I think
would
that's great.
ask,
Yeah, let's hear some. Yeah, go ahead,
I would
Jason.
ask the question, Kevin, why are they calling you? Right? They're calling you because they have a compliance concern, right? I mean, back to your statement
Yes.
about, well, PCI developer training. Hey, how about we make that better? How about we turn that in developer training into pen testing? In my consulting career, that's what we did. I never walked in and said, here's the best way to implement this line of code. In fact, I never talked code. I walked in and said, here is how I attack your code. Right.
Yes.
And it was amazing to watch people go, oh yeah, look, we've got XSS on our main page. And it's one of those things where we just need to fundamentally change what it is that we're doing. If it's a compliance driver, great. That's going to move a lot of business. Let's change the way we make the compliance drivers pull in the training that we're going to give or whatever those pieces are. I agree. And I work for a tools company, right? The answer is rarely tools, unless you need to implement something that humans can't do. Right.
Yeah,
So
Mike, you mentioned
Go ahead.
maybe we need to change something in the code to be easier for the tools to read. I don't think so. I don't think that anyone should change anything for a tool. The tools are supposed to work for you. If you use them, that's excellent. But they are working for you. And you will not be able to change the culture of development just by saying, okay, from now on, put another tilde somewhere because someone needs that for the tool. It will not work. It will not hold water. The only thing that will work, and there are many, many different kinds of ways of keeping documentation, and you talked about that, and we all know Open API and similar. The only thing that will work is the policy that your developers will adopt. That's it. If there's a way that you can make sure that your developers adopt some way, it will be much better than anything else you will just drop on their heads.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it definitely sounds like we're getting to a consensus that, tools obviously don't solve the problem, but we still have, for example, this XSS still exists, 25 years later since the dawn of the web. So we can't just tell people to stop writing XSS or showing them. What can we do if let's set aside the security testing tools, because it doesn't sound like that's the smart direction, but maybe we want to design these better. And I think that's what a lot of the underlying implication here was with the education, with the training, train the trainer, so to speak, is that we want to design things better because we know what the problems are. So when you do have these early discussions with teams designing their APIs, what's a top 1 or 2 item that you start to approach in so that we can actually get rid of a vulnerability class altogether and not even have to worry about it or spend time on that pen testing to see if this vuln exists or not?
We don't focus on getting rid of vuln classes. And the reason we don't, I totally get the idea. I understand it. I can see places where that makes sense. We don't try to get rid of vuln classes because we're never going to, right? And the reason I say we're never going to is I can still pick locks, right? It's always going to be a problem. What we focus on, the number one thing that we recommend organizations to do is to focus on making sure, and I think Sven said it earlier, that we need to have them focus on what is the reason this API exists, both the good, like what is the goal the business had for putting this forward, and the bad, what is the problem. And as long as they can understand that at the beginning level, here's why we do this, we find that the entire thing is better prepared for attacks. It's better prepared to secure the data because it was consciously thought about before it was developed.
So that's one of the things too. So if we're talking about some of the basics of, create an asset inventory, or just have an inventory, that's one of the tenets of security. But it's one of those things that it's extremely easy to say, kind of difficult to do. And Kevin, you were making a good point there, the distinction that we're not just talking about the APIs themselves, but we're also talking about the data that the APIs are handling. So I'm kind of curious, what would we tease apart here between the difference of, sure, I know where all my APIs are, but what about, do I know what kind of data my API is handling, or what should I be doing better to either maybe avoid collecting certain types of data, or how can I have the data handled more securely with my APIs?
I feel like I'm talking all the time, so I'm going to let somebody else.
No, I can tell you that the best ways to handle that are those who manage to document and collect some kind of metadata about the API. Not only the API endpoint and what it does, but also how much should I worry about that specific endpoint or API? Is it internal or external?
Mhm.
Is it to a partner or completely internal? Is it something about login? I mean, if it has something from the login world, maybe I want to protect it a bit more. Does it carry private information? Maybe some password hashes, maybe something else. So I think that as much data you have or metadata about a specific API or a specific endpoint will probably allow you to have a better vision of the areas that needs more of your attention. Obviously, which brings us back to the pains of documentation, but also here I must say that I don't agree with all of you that tools are completely unnecessary. They just need to come with a specific culture. So sometimes actual tools for recognizing or identifying or discovery tools of your APIs sometimes can surprise the people that you show them something that is spawned up and running, and they didn't even know that it's running since 2017. Oh, it's still up there. Nice, interesting.
Well, and
So, yeah,
this
go
is
ahead.
exactly where tools give you a
Yes.
big advantage, right?
Yeah.
Tools should surface problems.
Mhm.
Tools shouldn't, be the thing that identifies the solution to the problem.
Totally.
Tools should simply surface the problem so that a human
Wonderful
can
point.
say, "Oh yeah, we should have turned that off."
If anybody takes away from this that we believe tools are unnecessary, they weren't. They were taking the wrong thing away. I absolutely believe tools are necessary. Exactly how Jason said it. If they're surfacing the problem, and how you said it, that they're not dumped on the developer. They work with the developers, right? We tools are great. Where I think maybe it came across that I was saying tools are unnecessary was I don't think tools are where we should start. We see way too often where, I worked at Blue Cross of Florida, and uh, it, every single vendor that ever did a presentation could put the Blue Cross of Florida logo on their presentation as a customer because they bought more tools than I think any other organization in the world. And most of them sat on a shelf somewhere, right? Um, that's if you're buying tools to buy tools, then you're making a mistake. If you're buying tools instead of fixing your processes or making sure your people are educated, you're making a mistake. If you're buying tools and implementing them so that they work well with what you do, then that's a damn good tool, right? But the thing to keep in mind is you have to make sure that that tool does what you need, but people understand the limitations of it, right? We see way too often where security comes out and says, got it, we're going to start doing automated source code analysis, and every single time you check into source control, it's going to shove it over to a tool like whatever, and that tool is going to generate a report, and you fix everything in that report. And there's this lack of understanding that there are false positives and false negatives in every single tool. And if a salesperson ever says to you, no, our tool doesn't have false positives or false negatives, and we all know tools that do that, that salesperson needs to be punched in the throat. If we get the way the tool works, if we understand the limitations and the focus of the tool, that's a great thing to put into a process, right?
Yeah,
So-
I agree with that. I also think that tools are important for discovering vulnerabilities, even in APIs. As Mike already said, there are a lot of points in the API top 10 that overlap with the traditional web top 10. And I think tools are a great way to find vulnerabilities that you maybe missed for some reason, because as we know, even top companies like Google that spend a large amount of money just to get developers that know what they are doing and to find and fix vulnerabilities either through internal pen tests or bug bounties, etc. Even those companies still end up with XSS vulnerabilities because they are just so easy to introduce, even if you know what you're doing, if you know the concept and all these things that go with it. And I think that tools can really help to pick up these mistakes that you maybe make, even if you're well aware of the concepts that you should apply to avoid these vulnerabilities.
Well, I think, I mean, I don't think any of us on here, except for maybe Kevin, haven't, either worked for a tool vendor or part of a tool vendor. Mike and I used to work together at a tool vendor. The tools are going to cause both problems and solutions. I mean, I remember bringing Mike a case where I was like, the scanner won't scan this website because it was written best viewed in IE4, and this wasn't.
And that was in 2019.
Yeah. But the tool vendor that I work for now, one of the things that we try to do is to simply surface issues, right? So if you're trying to get to the heart of the matter, a lot of the tools can help with that. Our API product allows you to see what you have turned on, what sort of inventory out the API. And those are the kinds of things that I think that we're missing when we look at real problems, right? S3 buckets. There isn't a good tool that tells us that they're set up right, and there isn't a tool that screams at you when you have it open to the world, right? And those are the kinds of things that we can solve with all of that.
Yeah.
But the culture, back to Kevin's point, has to be that we need to understand what the tool does. Does it work in our environment? Sales guys will tell you it always works in your environment.
Yep.
But maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're running IE4, compliant code, and nobody's written tools for that lately. But we have to get to those really hard problems, like you don't have an inventory of your data. You don't have an inventory of your API endpoints. You don't know that delete is also enabled on that put endpoint, right? That kind of stuff.
Yep. I think the data one is very important. I'll give you an example from one of my customers. We went out and we met with an organization that works in entertainment. Let's put it that way, right? And we were doing awareness. We were actually meeting with the business units and stuff like that and talking about awareness and security and stuff like that. And we started talking about data, and we said, okay, well, what kind of data do you need to protect? And the room was like, oh, PII, social security numbers. And this one lady in the room said, celebrity cell phone numbers. And that is the most critical piece of data that my team works with. And before I could say anything, the people in the room were like, that's crud. We're not worried about celebrity cell phone numbers. And the woman's like, she buckled down. Like, she's like, yes, dang it. This is the most important thing we need to follow. And I said, okay, wait, before you all like gang up on this poor woman, like let's find out why she thinks that's so severe, because look, she's adamant. And it turned out that some legalese, right? The contract that they had with the majority of the celebrities they worked with actually put financial penalties on losing the cell phone numbers of the celebrity. That it was actually one of the things called out. It's up to you to figure out why. I don't know, but here was a case where the majority of the room, there was probably 100 people in the room, and one person understood that that piece of data was actually important to the organization, right? So it's not just, you know, you guys have all said it, it's not just, let me know what the data is. It's actually understanding why that data is critical, why that, you know, because I'll use another stupid example. If I had said to you, I'm worried that that HVAC vendor may be compromised and gain access to the cash register system at a, right? If I had said that to you 20 years ago, I am sure that you would have said, Kevin, shut the hell up. You're stupid. There is no way that HVAC vendor could get access. I'm just saying.
No, and I think the theme that I'm hearing emerge here is that context for humans, and just Kevin's point was very much what's the sure we're in an entertainment company collecting a lot of data, but the context is that those celebrities have, you know, there's a financial impact, which is pretty quantifiable. And once you can quantify security and with dollars, that's going to get a lot of people's attention. It goes back to.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, because even Jason mentioned that at the very beginning too. What's the you spinning up a whole bunch of new instances is a direct cost, and if spending more money is your reaction to getting more attacks, that's not necessarily a winning strategy. And even as you were saying, with decorating our metadata about our APIs. You were describing it context for the human so that humans can understand what is the data we're collecting here. So as we're unfortunately getting near the end of our session here, but I'm curious from each of you, what additional context would you throw onto developers as they're thinking about building their new APIs, either from the design, build, all the way to perhaps even just deploy and maintain?
I would say understand the user. Is this a computer to computer communication, or is this a mobile endpoint? Is somebody going to be walking around with your code? You have to understand what the user is that there is here. You know, if you have a mobile app that you're going to deploy an API for, I can take that mobile app apart and find all of your API endpoints really easily. In fact, I teach a class on that. So it's a understand who your user is and understand what data you're going to hand them.
Yeah. If I may, I will say that for developers and security, I want to extend that, is that the most important thing is to ask, right? Talk to people. The sheer number of times that I go into an organization and security never hears questions from the developers, or worse, when security hears questions from the developers, security pushes back that it's their fault, their problem. They're like, we're all in this together. And I won't tell you there's no such thing as a dumb question, because there are dumb questions. But if you have a dumb question, ask it anyways, because it's still your question, right? Like this. Talk to people, explore things, be willing to say, and I think it's been said multiple times, what happens if somebody does this? What happens if somebody does that? I don't call it threat modeling when I talk to developers. It is threat modeling. But that we add too many acronyms and fancy words, and we try very hard. I think it's because so many of us never went to college that we decide that we have to use big words to make ourselves sound smart. Stop doing that. But yeah, ask questions.
Yeah, and maybe even mark in the very basic way, is it sensitive or not? Something that's flying through the air now. We have all these microservices and APIs, information and data and parameters and filters, and everything is just flying through the air. Today it goes from A to B. Tomorrow, by design, it will go to C. You don't know if C is still in the same perimeter of B. Is it okay? Is it not okay? Is it somehow filtered? The information you're sending now to that endpoint or receiving or whatever, what happens if tomorrow, by design or not, suddenly that microservice is becoming public? And it happens all the time. Things change all the time. Something that was only accessible by several microservices or other services suddenly becomes accessible from totally another flow or path. I don't really know what a good way of marking that would be, but if we kind of say, yeah, that's sensitive, that's not, let's focus on the sensitive and see that we know where it is, we know where it's going and why.
Yeah, I would say if you're in the lucky position that you are able to design your API from scratch and don't have to work with some legacy APIs that were there like before you even started your job, then I would say that you should certainly narrowly define which data you want to put in and which data should go out. And then to make sure that there is no other data going in or out. What I mean is, for example, preventing things as mass assignment, and just really define which data goes into your endpoint, or what others said, maybe that you query your endpoint and for your user and suddenly expose the password hash or some other internal data, then you really should make sure that the output also matches your expectation, and do so in the design stage and put measures in place that will guarantee that only the data you want to have exposed or that you want to put your users into the application, only that this data will actually end up there.
Well, I'm definitely in the lucky position to have been able to speak with all of you. And while we were talking about legacy vulns, perhaps, hopefully I think there's a lot of good information here that will avoid actually legacy APIs, and we can build new APIs securely from scratch. So Sven, Erez, Jason, Kevin, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I also want to thank everyone who came by to watch. Make sure to check out more of the unlocked sessions. And if you're building an API, make it a protected implementation.